Hello and welcome to all our friends and viewers joining us from cities across the US and the world for today's webinar. My name is Cassia Laham, and I'm so happy to be moderating this event organized by the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. And I couldn't be more thrilled to be hosting today's webinar, in particular, a report back from Syria, during which time we will hear from three amazing organizers and human rights activists who recently returned from a very important trip to Syria. As a Syrian American myself, I'm excited that these three awesome speakers will be providing you all with context for the recent election in Syria, along with the observation they made about the political, economic, and social situations going on in Syria. But before I introduce these awesome folks, a little bit of background for our viewers and listeners. As many of you, if you're tuning in, you likely already know that the United States and its allies in the region have really been waging a military and economic war against the people of Syria and their government for 10 years now. This year marked the 10th year, by arming and financially supporting terrorist groups in Syria who oppose the elected president Bashar al-Assad. The US initiated and dragged out a very deadly war in Syria that has killed and displaced tens of thousands of people. And the question is why? Right? Why is the United States taking part in such a bloodbath in Syria? Why has it initiated such a warfare against the people of Syria? Well, the United States has long hoped to rid the Middle East of Arab nationalist ideology and leadership. The US has gotten involved in wars and covert operations to get rid of leaders for decades now in that region. You could talk about Nasser in Egypt, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Gaddafi in Libya, and whether you agree or disagree with their political positions, these are all leaders who somehow opposed US intervention in their country or the region. And Arab nations who oppose American economic and military domination of the region have long fallen victim to US imperialism, as many other countries in the world have as well. And all but really two have collapsed under America's might in the region. And the only two really autonomous Arab nations that don't rely on or bow to the whims of US economic and military interests as of this year, 2021, are Syria and Iran. The two countries who can easily, we can all notice, have been targets of American military and economic warfare. Syria and Iran remain constant obstacles to US hegemony in the region. Both countries refuse American oil companies drilling rights. Both countries refuse American military bases and presence. Both countries align closely somehow with either Russia or China, which the US views as major economic competitors on the global stage. And both countries act as counterweights to the US-backed Saudi regime in the Arab world. So by getting rid of the Assad government, the US was hoping to weaken not only Syria and Iran, but those groups that rely on the two countries to resist US imperialism and Zionism in the region. Groups in Lebanon, Yemen, Palestine that are fighting every day to resist dominance by Israel, to resist dominance by Saudi Arabia and the United States. And that is why the United States is willing to risk plenty, lie plenty more, and kill even more to see this forced regime change through. But as our speakers will, I'm sure, explain to us now, this regime change war the US has been waging against Syria just hit a really big snag, the most recent Syrian election. So without further ado, allow me to please introduce our three awesome speakers. We will be hearing today from Wyatt Miller, an organizer with the Minnesota Anti-War Committee and a member of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, Twin Cities. We'll be hearing from Ted Kelly, a member of Workers' World Party in Philadelphia, who represented the International Action Center on the international delegation to the 2021 Syrian presidential election. She's also co-editor of Tear Down the Walls at workers.org and a correspondent for Means Morning News at means.tv. And we got Kobi Guillory, co-chair of the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, as well as a member of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization and BLM Chicago. So welcome to all of you. If it's okay with you, I would love to start off with some questions I'm going to throw your way. Any of you can feel free to chime in at any point to answer any of these questions as we go along. And if we have time at the end, we'll also take some questions from the audience if you all are comfortable with that and if we have time. So if we can, I'll go ahead and start with maybe the most direct question. And again, anyone can sort of chime in here. What was the purpose in traveling to Syria last month? What was the purpose of the group? Why did y'all go?
I can take a stab at it. So essentially, we were there to observe the elections. There's a lot of like if you Google Syria right now, you're going to find a lot of imperialist, pro-regime change nonsense. And a lot of that has been fueled by reporters, quote unquote reporters, quote unquote journalists, with these racist corporate news channels like New York Times, CNN, BBC, and we were kind of there to counteract that propaganda. We don't have the same kind of platform as those other companies, but we are activists, we are organizers, we do have a connection to communities and to to each other, to other anti-imperialists, and the people that we spoke to, the footage that we got, the pictures that we took, are they run counter to the imperialist narrative. So that was at least my personal purpose for going there. Because I don't want to speak for every single member of the delegation, but that was pretty much why we were there, just to expose the truth about what's going on in Syria, and counteract all the stream of lies that have been coming out.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Kobi. Who else? Anybody else? Oh, go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that we went is to have conversations just like this one, and I know Kobi and Wyatt in particular have been doing some excellent reporting for Fight Back News, because we wanted to go and then report back honestly on what we saw. And like Kobi said, because we're organizers, because we're community activists, I think it's important that people who trust us and people who understand that we care about international workers, that we care about the people in our community, that we're not going to try and fool you, that we are being honest about what we saw, and we have no material reason to misrepresent the truth. I think also that once we were there and we spoke to Syrians, that our purpose didn't change, but it certainly took on another dimension. I certainly feel much more adamant about telling the truth of what's going on in Syria now that I've been there.
Thanks, Ted. Definitely. It's important, the counteract what you guys are saying about the corporate news media and the lies that are being spewed and the interest that they have in doing that. Whereas, as honest members of our local communities, I think this takes on a very important and different type of weight. So Wyatt, I'm imagining you maybe have a similar story. So maybe if you can, as opposed to telling us the purpose, maybe you can tell us, okay, so you all were there, you were, were observing these elections. What was going on in these elections? Who were the people running? What were the main parties or individuals? Did they represent certain interests? What did you see there as far as the election is concerned?
Sure. Yeah. So there were 3 candidates in the election, and they represented 3 different political parties under Syria's 2012 constitution, which was approved by a democratic referendum. Syria is a pluralist republic where there are competing political parties. So obviously the incumbent president, Bashar al-Assad, was running with the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. And, spoiler, I'll just cut to the chase, he won in what was reported to be a landslide, which basically conformed with what we witnessed in terms of some mass support in the streets. But there were also two other candidates, and we did see campaign posters for both of them around Damascus, and they represented different. They had different platforms, and I can tell you a little bit about both of those. The first was Abdullah Salim Abdullah, who is a former cabinet minister who represented a political party called the Socialist Unionist Party, which I understand to be sort of modeled after Nasser's party in Egypt. So it's sort of a different competing strain of Arab nationalism. And interestingly, that party is actually part of the same National Progressive Front coalition as the ruling Ba'ath Party. But he sort of ran as saying, oh, maybe we could have a different balance of forces within that coalition. And then the other candidate was Mahmoud Mareh, who was more of like an opposition figure, associated with some of the Arab Spring protests that happened in 2011. His party is called the Democratic Arab Socialist Union, which has been around for decades and, has variously been at odds with the Syrian government. But after the 2012 constitution, they opted, instead of joining the some of these armed groups in promoting an armed overthrow, they instead opted to join with the democratic process. So in that sense, it's obviously it's kind of a short list of candidates, but that's sort of a feature of what democracy looks like when your country is under attack. Candidates who were running with funding and support from the United States or Turkey or Qatar, they weren't allowed to run, which, in the abstract, maybe that sounds undemocratic, but, I think we have to ask ourselves, there was such hubbub in the United States over the idea that maybe Russia somehow supported the Trump candidacy just through social media posts. And, can we imagine if Russia had been arming and funding mercenaries for Trump for 10 years and causing a terrible, terrible, destructive war that killed hundreds of thousands of people before the election? Like, we wouldn't allow Trump to run in that circumstance. It just wouldn't make sense. So I think it's important to understand that about this election, similar to elections that happen in Venezuela or in Iran. And I also just think it's worth to note too, little known fact under the 2012 Constitution is that this will be President Assad's final consecutive term. There are actually term limits under that Constitution, and contrary to what's reported often. So, I hope that's some background for the election.
Definitely, Wyatt. Thank you for elaborating on that for all of us. Did any of our other two folks want to chime in? Did Wyatt cover all your bases?
Just to say that the National Progressive Front that Wyatt talked about does include a number of Syrian communist parties, and that Mohammed Mer'i, who is one of the opposition leaders, actually represented the opposition in international conferences. I agree with Wyatt that if there was somebody running for president in any country who hadn't lived in the country for the last 10 years, I think that would probably be suspect. That was one of the things that would, bar someone from running as a candidate. But yeah, I think Wyatt did a great.
Awesome. All right, y'all. So let's see if we can move on from here. Oh gosh, we have a furry friend on camera. Okay, so Wyatt and Ted just explained to us what went on in the election. Yet we know that, we've all been hearing the Western corporate media trying to brush off the elections, saying it's illegitimate. You were there as election observers. You reported back saying the elections ran smoothly and the election was a democratic process. So why why is the U.S. media going to continue to try to brush off this election? I mean, we saw it in Venezuela too, right? So what's the common thread here? Why do they consistently sort of frame these elections as illegitimate?
I can start us off. I know everybody has some things to say on this point, um, but you know they started saying that it was an illegitimate election, you know, as soon as it was announced. You know, like a month and a half before it actually happened. I think it was longer than that, but you know, the moment it was announced, they said, you know, this is going to be a sham election. This is a dictator. Assad is evil, and then you know use that opportunity to spread more and more regime change propaganda. Um, and you know the reason they do that is because um, you know Syria is an anti-imperialist country, and it is a sovereign country. That means America doesn't get to decide who's the president of Syria. So because Syrians themselves are deciding who the president of Syria is, that doesn't really sit right with America, and with you know America's allies, the UK, France, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Israel. You know, speaking of undemocratic countries, I hope it's not too much of a tangent, but apartheid state Israel, um, monarchies like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, um, and then, of course, you've got the US, you know, the biggest prison state in history. You know, this is the alliance of countries that are saying that Syria is undemocratic, that there's something wrong with Syria's elections. Um, and, you know, if you have looked at Syrian history for the past 10 years, and, you know, even before that, what people's lives were like before the war versus after the war versus after their cities and their neighborhoods have been liberated by the Syrian army. It you know logically nobody was going to beat Bashar al-Assad in those elections because you know these are people who lived under you know occupation by ISIS, by Jaish al-Islam, by al-Nusra, which is you know the Al Qaeda affiliate in Syria. Um, so they lived under that. You know, the freedom and democracy that America was trying to bring to them was you know beheadings in the streets by jihadists. You know, it was women being forced to cover up. It was people being thrown out of buildings. You know, for not being straight. Um, you know, all of these things that people lived under versus um, Syria as a secular country where people actually have the right to, you know, live their lives. So of course, people are going to vote for Assad. And I took I took a whole bunch of videos. I was in Umayyad Square during you know, the announcements of the results, and people were celebrating. It was like a whole festival, you know, and um, you know there's no way to fake that kind of enthusiasm, that kind of joy, you know, for millions of people across an entire country. You know, Syria um, is not like they don't have some kind of like mind control thing that they put in the water. You know, they like these people are celebrating because they want to, and many of them told me that. And so if we could play that video, it's just like a quick like 30 seconds of just people celebrating in Umayyad Square. Yeah, and um, Yeah, so that's something that you're not going to see, on CNN or on BBC, because it shows so clearly what the Syrian people want. They want America to get out, and they are united behind this anti-imperialist government, this government that is led by Assad, to get to end the influence of the U.S. and of Turkey and that Zionist entity and all these other countries that are trying to undermine Syrian sovereignty and steal their natural resources and subjugate the people. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Kobi, and thank you for the video. I mean, it's really incredible to see the people in the street celebrating like that, and it isn't anything that you would see on your corporate news media networks, or even other some other sort of social democrat type of networks as well. And it's amazing because, to be clear, there's no evidence that there's been any sort of electoral fraud in Syria, that there was any sort of discrepancies in the elections. And to be clear, they were saying this since before the election and the results were even published. So, this is a far cry from the United States, where there actually is election fraud and where we, keep people from voting every year based on, Jim Crow age laws that have been in place for over 100 years. So it's really incredible, that the United States can get away, and its news networks can get away with talking about illegitimate elections in other countries when we've been not only having illegitimate elections in this country, but conducting coups in countries throughout the world, right? Did anybody else want to respond to that question, just about the media and the U.S. as a whole sort of describing this election as illegitimate?
I think Wyatt may have wanted to say something, but I'll just add one quick point too, is that the election was legitimate despite the attempts of the US and NATO powers to make it less legitimate. In France, where there are tens of thousands of Syrian refugees, France closed its consulates so that those Syrians could not vote in the election. In Germany, where there are at least 800,000 Syrian refugees, Germany closed their consulates so that those Syrians almost 1 million Syrians couldn't vote in the elections. Where in Lebanon, in Qatar, in countries elsewhere where the Syrians have left during this decade of fighting, they were able to vote. In fact, there were physical attacks against some Syrians going to the polls in Beirut. So despite all this, there was still a really astonishing turnout of, 14 million Syrian voters across the world.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Ted, about the just how much voting there was actually going on outside of Syria as well as within Syria. I'll just add that, one of the big takeaways from our whole trip, I think, was that for the Syrians we spoke with, the election was sort of represented something bigger than just voting, picking a candidate. It was, I think people saw it as a turning point for the whole country after this decade of war. Most of the country has been liberated by the government. And, so for the first time in some young people's lives, there is some relative stability. And we saw a lot of just normal life going on as people try to get back to normal. And I think this kind of was reflected in, we saw many, many demonstrations of support, not only for President Assad, but for Syria in general, to sort of celebrate the election during the lead up in the days before too. We saw, I don't know if we could screen the video of car caravans of people driving around, waving Syrian flags, holding up signs of their candidate. And yeah, I think one of the most kind of impactful things was to see that a lot of these people were very young people, some of whom were probably not even of voting age, but they were still really excited about this election because it seems really to represent for them the possibility of normal life coming back, having defeated this terrible intervention by the U.S. and its allies.
Thanks, y'all. That's just really, it's really incredible what you all were able to witness there. And it's so important to bring that back because there is such, we are inundated every day with, false accusations against countries throughout the world who just oppose the U.S. global plan, right? And so having you all being able to honestly report back from a people's perspective is so important. So we have people going, we have these reports, firsthand accounts of what's going on. You all witnessed the election, you witnessed Syria. But in recent months, since really Joe Biden got elected, we've seen, anti-imperialist organizations and folks on the left who are being called out by so-called progressives and social democrats, like people at The Nation, people like Noam Chomsky, like writing letters and writing articles, basically denouncing folks like you who are saying, hey, the U.S. shouldn't be intervening in Syria, and we should respect the autonomy and sovereignty of Syria. So why do you think that is? And why now? Like, why are people, really since the Biden election, in my opinion, this is what I have really witnessed. Since the Biden election, we've seen an uptick in rhetoric, in militaristic rhetoric and propaganda against Syria. Why? Like, why now? I don't know. Whoever wants to tackle this, go for it. I know it's a big question.
I can start. You can hear my cat wanting to get in the background too. So to begin with, there was a highly sophisticated propaganda campaign with a specific purpose of convincing liberals and progressives that regime change in Syria, that overthrowing the Syrian government was a moral issue. The things that we had heard for literally a decade, that he's killing his own people, that there are chemical weapons attacks, these kinds of things, that Assad must go. I mean, how many world leaders did we hear say Assad must go in NATO countries, the United States, in Israel, of course? And we have to understand that the justification for imperialist aggression and imperialist violence has changed over time. And the ruling class, the capitalists, know this. They have to, because manifest destiny is a little bit on the nose. They can't say that God gave them the right to take Syrian oil fields over. That doesn't fly anymore. And nor really does it fly anymore to say that, we're the European countries are sending shock troops to India and Central America and Africa as on a civilizing mission, because now we understand correctly how racist that is as well. But the reigning ideology now, the justification for these imperialist attacks, is human rights and international law. That if you can concoct any crime, any justification, anything that the state does that makes it the sovereignty of a country illegitimate in the eyes of the international community, quote unquote, which is to say international finance capital, then that is a reason to invade, to sanction, to kill, and to starve people. And I think that we need to, as a class, and particularly in the United States, we have to find a way to stop reinventing the wheel every time there is an attack on our brothers, sisters, and siblings abroad, so that when the next imperialist plan comes, whether it be again on Venezuela or Bolivia or Peru, Iran, anywhere, that we know that if the State Department, the US State Department is saying it, it's a lie. Or at the very least, they're not saying it because they care about human rights. They're saying it because they want to eliminate resistance. And of course, Syria was the target because of its historic resistance to Zionism and US imperialism and European imperialism. I think if social democrats and liberals are more susceptible to this kind of propaganda, it's because a Leninist conception of imperialism is very effective at cutting through the propaganda, that we know that these wars come out of the development of monopoly capitalism, of finance capitalism, and that is ultimately the justification or the reason for these attacks, regardless of the justification. That's why Syria was under attack. So I think it's one of the reasons that we see this sort of very unfortunate but very effective campaign to confuse people.
Thanks, Ted. It's really remarkable how the two parties unite in their imperialist agenda, but how you'll see the rhetoric change, how you said, the cloak of human rights is something utilized by the Democratic Party, knowing that, the general liberal, supporter is one who is, correctly supportive of, human rights, right? And the idea of justice and humanity and all that. And they twist reality to try and get that support. Whereas under Trump, you saw it much more like, we need to be bombastic and we need to, flex our military muscles in Syria, right? It was a different rhetoric, but it was with the same, very similar end goal, right? So I find that very interesting. And it's important for folks to really understand that, right? That the two parties are two sides of the same coin. Or as my loved ones say, two cheeks of the same ass. All right, so I don't know if anybody else would like to contribute to that question. Go for it if you are so inclined.
I just wanted to jump in real quick because you asked one of the questions. Part of the question was, why now? Why do some of these people, why do they try to split the anti-war movement over Syria now? And frankly, I don't really have an answer, but I think it's an important question to ask those people because now is not the time to have some abstract conversation about, what would we, in a total magical utopia, how would we want Syria to be governed? As living in the United States, especially, I don't think anybody's mentioned it yet so far. There are U.S. troops on the ground in eastern Syria occupying Syria's oil fields. There's no justification for it under international law. It's called pillaging under international law. So we have a U.S. occupation of Syria. We have 10 years of U.S. sending billions of dollars of weaponry and mercenary salaries to groups trying to violently overthrow the Syrian government. And we also have terrible destructive sanctions, which we'll probably talk more about. So, now is the time to have unity and say U.S. out. It only weakens it only strengthens the hand of the United States to have the anti-war movement fighting amongst themselves about these abstract questions when the actual concrete reality is that the U.S. is doing its thing. It's destroying a country.
Yeah. It's incredible to me too sometimes how folks who have been in the movement for such a long time can still be duped or used by the State Department. It weakens the anti-war movement, which at this point needs to be built up and propped up and not be internally divided. So I will go ahead. I'm gonna just ask one more question sort of about the politics in Syria, and the elections and all that. And then from there, I know you all also went to different places. You were able to observe things outside of the election as well. So I'll ask a little bit about sort of society, what you observed in Syrian society. But beforehand, my last question regarding the elections and the result. So, people come from different political backgrounds and, might have nuanced differences or very wide differences between themselves and like the elected government of Syria. And not everybody will share the politics of Bashar al-Assad, but why is it important for anti-imperialists to acknowledge and support an Assad victory in Syria?
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. So something, whenever you oppose, the regime change propaganda that's going around about Syria, people will call you an Assadist. They'll say, well, how could you support Assad? He's this, he's that, he's this. And, first of all, it's important to kind of ground people in reality, and because people have been fed all this misinformation, all these falsehoods about Syria. So it's important to start from a place of, not assuming that what is written about Assad in the New York Times or in Reuters or in, these news outlets owned by like the German government or like the Qatari government. It's important not to assume that all of that stuff is true. Like Ted said, if all these countries are mobilizing against the country, it's safe to assume that they're lying. It's safe to assume, like they lied about Iraq, like they lied about Libya, like they lied about Korea, and the list goes on and on and on, of how many countries they've lied about in order to destroy those countries and make those countries safe for imperialist corporations to, establish, to buy up oil fields, to take food out of that country, to take natural resources. So that's the first thing that needs to be established is, the facts. And then the second thing, and I think probably even before you know what the facts are, I think it's important to understand again that Syria is a sovereign country. And if you're sitting in the U.S. or the U.K. or somewhere far, far away from Syria, it doesn't. You don't get to vote for who the president of Syria is. Living in New York, as someone who is not a Syrian, as someone who a lot of these people don't speak Arabic, and they're talking about how Syria should be governed. And that's that's just a very important thing, is that Syrians deserve the right to self-determination. They deserve the right to pick their own leaders and their own style of government. And that is a right that the U.S. threatens in order to bring jihadists in and to just completely destroy and ransack the country. So that's something that every single person who cares about oppressed people, every person who cares about working class people in the U.S. And in every other country needs to be opposed to. You need to be opposed to the U.S. thinking that it can topple other people's governments. Whether or not you agree with those governments is not relevant. The fact is that Syrians have their government the way that they want it, and the U.S. needs to get up.
Hell yeah, Kobi. Oh, that's awesome. All right. Does anybody want to add anything to Kobi's really great analysis there?
I think that it's a Kobi summed it up perfectly. I would just really want to emphasize that it's the height of imperialist chauvinism to say that sitting in the United States or France or the UK, that better who should be in charge of the Syrian government than the Syrians who live there. Something that the anti-war movement has said for a long time when there's an attack on a country is, could you even find it on a map? which is not like a gotcha, to impugn someone's intelligence. It's to remind people that you may not even have discursive access to this country. You really know nothing about it, and yet to advocate for regime change or war is going to kill people. And I think that it's so flippant to do that, and really dangerous. And to remember that all the U.S. propaganda needs to do here is not convince people of the moral righteousness of the war or the regime change efforts, but just confuse and muddy the waters enough that we don't resist.
And, on that same thread, just to maybe tie it up in a nice, pretty knot, the American people are wholehearedly against U.S. military intervention in Syria. That's something that we saw time and time again. That's it was a huge reason why Barack Obama, when, he initially started, doing his lean, mean attacks on Syria, it's why he didn't add more boots on the ground. It's why they had to keep things really confusing and strange. It's why they had to continue to sort of push their own red line further and further, right? They kept saying, maybe if he has chemical weapons, and then they made up something about chemical weapons, and then people were like, no, we don't want you to go to war. And then they pushed it. Well, if he uses chemical weapons, and then somehow he magically used chemical weapons, and still, Americans were saying, no, we don't want you to be, attacking another country, using resources, using money, and killing innocent people, when we ourselves are not really clear on what the motivation is. And, so I think that's an important fact too, even though the anti-war movement itself it is, historically low. I think anti-war sentiments are actually at an all-time high in the United States, especially amongst the working class. And I think that's an important point for us to remember. All right. So that sums up our sort of first part of the questions. Was there anything else that folks I didn't get to touch on about the elections that folks wanted to point out before we get to the second round of questions about Syrian society more broadly?
Make one very quick point about the elections is that we did speak to some people who didn't vote, who exercised their right not to vote, which some people are very politically active in Syria. Some people are not. Like many members of our class, they don't spend their entire time thinking about international politics like we do. But I thought that was interesting and important to note that there are some people who, framed it as I'm exercising my right not to vote at all. And important because the idea that somehow people were coerced to vote, we saw firsthand that wasn't true.
Yeah, that's another tried and used line, right? When elections happen and the results are not what the United States wants, people are somehow coerced. All right, anything else before we move along to our second part? Anything I may have missed that folks would like to add? All right, let's move on to part two. So I wanted to ask you all about sort of the society and human side of things outside of the election itself. So I know you all were able to travel to different places, meet a bunch of people. So what stood out to you about the people that you met in Syria? Is there any one story that you feel like is worth sharing with viewers about interactions you had with the people in Syria? And feel free to unmute at your leisure.
I'll say one thing that became abundantly clear very quickly is that everybody we talk to has some story of themselves or a family member being wounded, being killed, having a near miss, or in many cases being kidnapped by the right-wing militias that were supported by the United States, and the 84 countries whose the foreign that comprise the fighting force of these anti-government militants. We spent a week with one of the drivers who brought us around to different locations before we found out that he himself had been kidnapped by the Free Syrian Army, was forced to dig tunnels in underground so that the rebels could, the so-called rebels could bring material and flee the Syrian Arab army. He happened to know someone, or one of his captors knew his father when they were both in the Syrian Arab army together, and that man helped him escape. There's so many stories like this. And the proximity, I don't think I realized until we drove there, and the proximity to some of these rebel-held areas outside of Damascus, 15, 20-minute drive, right, Kobi and Wyatt? Like right outside the city, where there was intense fighting. The threat of violence, of fascist violence, was a daily occurrence. Every day there was a mortar attack that would kill at least one or two people. And so it's sort of hard to fathom surviving that daily assault for nearly a decade. And we also spoke to a lot of people who lived under the control, under the occupation of these, Islamist militias. We spoke to people who, like Kobi and Wyatt have already mentioned, the daily threats, the weekly public executions for smoking a cigarette or for being gay. Truly hellish conditions. We were in an ancient, truly ancient city called Malula, where many of the people who live in that town actually still speak Aramaic, a form of Aramaic. And we saw in some of these very, very old religious sites, these beautiful, beautiful mosaics, the faces carved out of all of them, as just a sort of daily reminder of the truly backwards right-wing ideology of the forces that the United States was supporting. We talked to a man who was showing us around Malula, whose 4-year-old son was almost killed in a mortar attack by the rebels. He got very emotional talking to us about it. And now there's a new, though the fighting is over, we talked to Syrians who are experiencing a new kind of hell under the U.S. sanctions. I talked to a spice vendor, a guy who was selling all these different kinds of delicious spices in the souk near the Umayyad Mosque, who was holding up different packets of spices and telling me what the price was now and what it was 4 years ago. The Syrian pound has lost 70% of its value just this year alone because of U.S. sanctions, because the United States sanctions have made it impossible for financial transactions and for money to get pumped into the country, which was one of the few things keeping the Syrian economy afloat during the fighting, the years of fighting, was that money could still come into the country. We talked to a woman in Yarmouk who had just come back, hoping that when the reconstruction began, that she would be able to move back into her home. We talked to another man in Yarmouk who was a teacher who, again, this is the Palestinian, like the capital of the Palestinian diaspora. We talked to a guy whose mother was 6 months pregnant in Nablus in 1948 when she had to flee Palestine. And he's been living in Syria ever since, and he also had to flee his home. The woman we talked to who was homeless, she fled in 48. She had been displaced again by the anti-government militants. So, on one hand, talking to the people in Syria, you get a lot of these stories that are almost unfathomably horrible, and yet people are living their lives. They're doing their best. But I think the sanctions, even more than the war and the fighting now, really threatens to break people's morale. I'm sure Kobi and Wyatt can talk more about
To hear the human cost of U.S. intervention in Syria is absolutely appalling, and it brings us back to why so many of us, all of you included, do the work that you do against, opposing U.S. imperialism. This is the human cost of it, right? But the Syrian people are strong, as you said, and they're getting through, as best they can. But it's up to us to continue to resist these policies. Kobi, did you want to add something to that? I had seen your mic.
Oh yeah, yeah. I just wanted to say one thing that kind of surprised me a little bit was, or not surprised me, but struck me was how optimistic and how dignified people are in Syria. Um, because they've been through a lot. Like Wyatt said. I mean, like Ted said, every family has a story. Everybody, has some kind of, everybody has been affected. Their lives are being affected by the sanctions still. And they, they're hopeful. There were kids celebrating outside of polling places in Duma. Like small children. Excited to be out there on election day, which you would never see that kind of joy for anything political in the U.S. And one kid or this one kid was with his friends, and he had just turned 18, and his friends were like around the same age, and they had just voted for the first time, and they were ecstatic. And this one kid was saying, we all want to be doctors and engineers so that we can help rebuild Syria. And that's, they have an eye toward the future, and that, they want to, they have pride in their country that the U.S. has been trying to destroy, and that they've been fighting back. And I think that kind of galvanizes their sense of dignity. And again, we need to oppose those sanctions because, the war, the U.S.'s aggression against Syria is not over, and we need to keep fighting until imperialism is complete.
Thanks, Kobi. That's absolutely remarkable, the amount of determination and courage that the people in Syria, and not just Syria, but the people throughout the world who continue to face U.S. bombardment, economic, military, political, these intrusions in their daily lives, and how the U.S. makes it almost impossible for people to live a life in which they can breathe freely. It's amazing the amount of courage that we see and determination. That being said, I mean, the people of Syria have faced a lot, and yet I saw in a lot of your pictures, because I follow a lot of you folks on Facebook and other platforms, I saw pictures of people in Syria showing support for all sorts of different causes, even though they themselves, are being oppressed by U.S. imperialism. They were showing solidarity with people throughout the world. And I'd love to hear some of you all talk about that solidarity that the people in Syria showed.
Yeah, I can start out with this one. People were really strong in their solidarity with Palestine while we were there. And that was one of the big overwhelming kind of overarching impressions that I had of the whole trip. We got there just a couple days after the ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian resistance forces, who had been fighting for about 10 or 11 days, had been put in place. So that was really on everyone's minds. And virtually everyone we talked to brought it up. Some people brought it up before they even talked about Syria. There's a reason for that. And it was a little more clear than I expected. So, part of Syria has been occupied by Israel since 1967, which is the Golan Heights, and Syria has never given up that claim. But what I didn't know until I got to Damascus is you can literally see the occupied territory from Damascus. There's a mountain, a tall mountain to the west called Mount Hermon. In Arabic, they call it Jabal al-Sheikh. And it's got a little bit of snow on the top. And you can see it on a clear day from Damascus. And the southern slopes of that mountain are under Zionist occupation. And in fact, the settlers have actually even built a ski resort up there. So every day, at least from Damascus, Syrians are looking and seeing that part of their country has been under occupation. And, you know, the Syrians who live under that occupation continue to resist. And in general, you know, Syrians were very proud of the fact that their government has not made any kind of peace with Israel and continues to refuse to do that. Part of that was, you know, we saw it just from talking to ordinary people. Both Ted and Kobi, I know, had experiences where they were wearing a shirt or like a little pendant saying something about Palestine, and just people like, you know, workers would say, you know, nice, essentially. And, you know, Syrians really seem to consider the struggle kind of part of the broader Arab nationalist struggle, which is, you know, their whole national identity. So yeah, I'll leave it at that about the Palestinians.
I was going to mention the necklace that has a little pendant on it, the shape of Palestine. Multiple times a day in Syria, someone would point it out and say, "Is that Palestine?" I'd say, yeah, and they would be happy to see it. And, you know, one of the members of our delegation, Dr. Amal Wahdan, is a Palestinian. She's the founder and editor of the Arab Gazette, and is, you know, a very important figure with the One Democratic State of Palestine movement. And being in Syria with Amal was like having a Syrian guide with us. She was, you know, it's hard to understate the extent to which the Syrians consider the Palestinian liberation struggle part of their struggle.
Oh, I actually wanted to mention one more thing about this. During the conflict between Palestine and Israel that happened in May, obviously the resistance was firing rockets from Gaza. Obviously, people were rising up in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, but it didn't get reported very much. But there were also Palestinians in Syria who were joining that unity between all the different Palestinian forces in the region, and were you know, firing rockets from Syria as well. So, and people, like I said, people we talked to were really proud of that this new unity that's developing around Palestine, and that people are starting to overcome some of the factionalism, it seems.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I have a shirt that I was wearing at the like in the previous Frizzle live stream that I did about Palestinian solidarity, and I was wearing that in the hotel in Syria, and you know, someone came up to me and was like, you know, I'm from Haifa, you know, and he was young, you know, he was a waiter, and he was about you know, I'd say like in his 20s. So, you know, he's probably like never been there, but he's, you know, he's from there, you know, that's where he has a right to return to. And, you know, that's like a huge part of, you know, like Ted and Wyatt said, it's a huge part of Syrian identity to support that Palestinian struggle. And, you know, of course, it's not just Palestine. I had multiple people mention George Floyd. Um, we actually had a meeting with the Syrian Minister of Information, and a question about how the U.S. Well, in one of the questions I asked, I mentioned that the U.S. has no right to lecture anybody about democracy, and he said, well, the George Floyd uprising shows that this is in no position to be telling other countries about democracy. Um, so that of course was a global uprising, an uprising that was seen all over the world and was supported by oppressed people all over the world. Um, so yeah, that's just a point about solidarity, how powerful it is that people are saying George Floyd's name. People who don't even speak English are saying George Floyd's name in Syria and are up supporting the struggle of Black people in the U.S.
Thanks, Kobe. Thanks, Wyatt and Ted. Did anybody want to add anything? Question about solidarity? All right. So I have two more questions for you all, and then I'll just check if we have any questions from YouTube, Facebook, etc. So Ted already actually spoke about this a little bit. The actual physical impact that that U.S. aggression and intervention in Syria had on like the landscape itself, right? Because you all traveled to a bunch of different places, historical and non, and I'm sure you were able to see the impact of U.S. intervention, whether military or economic, in the region. And I was hoping you all could maybe elaborate on that, just what you saw.
Yeah, so we did travel to areas that had been held by these sort of contra mercenary groups for years, especially in the outskirts of Damascus. And I provided some footage and some pictures of this because these areas have now been liberated by the government, and they're starting to be rebuilt, and people are moving back. Some of the millions of displaced people are coming home finally. And I mean, it really is staggering to see the scale of the destruction. And just, it's like every single building has bullet holes in it. And there's rubble everywhere. Certainly nothing like anything I've ever seen before. It's hard to imagine, just the scope, the scale of what reconstruction is going to entail and, last. But we did see people doing it, and it was really kind of fascinating. Many of these buildings are still structurally, they have engineers who come through and have to evaluate it, make sure it's structurally sound before they allow people to move back in. So now you see this interesting where the building, and up, and there's piles of rubble, but there'll be here and there'll be a few apartments that have been redone and they're looking real nice, and some of them had some like plants growing on their balconies and whatnot, or some shops. There'll be shops in a little stall that are really shiny and brand new. And the most tragic thing about that whole scene is to know that things are preventing that from happening faster, and might, depending on how bad it gets, kind of forestall the whole thing. And most of the people we talk to seem to think that that is precisely the goal of these sanctions, which actually weren't imposed until a couple of years ago when the war was kind of winding down and things were looking better for the government. So then the U.S. came in and said, okay, we couldn't do it through force. Let's just, try to prolong the situation however we can and do these sanctions. Effectively, the U.S. is intentionally discouraging Syrians from returning to their homes by they can't do that.
That's just disgusting, and it's not a new tactic either, as you mentioned, Wyatt. I mean, that's the goal of a lot of these sanctions throughout the world that the U.S. has to try and force regime change by any means necessary if they can't do it with guns and drones, to try and create discord and anger and suffering. Just mass suffering. The U.S. is willing to impose mass suffering upon the people of Venezuela, Syria, Iran, to try and continue their agenda, which is totally unacceptable. But I'm really happy to hear both you, Ted, and Kobi have mentions of the Syrian people and how, despite these attempts by the United States to destroy from the inside out, people seem to persevere and show up and, go to work and go to school and try to live their lives and, and vote in an election by the millions, and that is true resilience, in my opinion. Okay, was there anything else anybody wanted to add to that? All right, so let's get to just in general. We focused a little bit on the impact that U.S. economic and military warfare have had on the Syrian geography and society. But in general, you all travel to a lot of places. What location had the largest impact on you, and why? And this can be a place, Syria has some of the most historical sites around. It could be perhaps an event that you were able to witness with your own eyes. Just, what had the biggest impact on you before you hopped on that flight to come back home?
I can start. At first I did want to say, just going to Jubar and Duma and Yarmouk in particular, like what Wyatt said, I'd never seen anything like that before, the extent of the destruction. And photos don't really get the message across, because you'll be driving down the highway and everything in your field of vision, literally, for the time that you're driving, is destroyed. In some places completely depopulated. That had a big impact on me. But to be subjective, just a little subjective for a second, it was in Malula that the history of Syria really, it started to make an impression on me that, this is not just a place that has, like one of the locals was telling us, caves up in the mountains that show signs of people having lived there 30,000 years ago, with engravings in some of these caves that indicate sun worship. That's how far back some of these settlements go. Or the Umayyad Mosque, which before it was the fourth holiest site in one of the four holy sites in Islam, it was the Roman temple of Jupiter. And before that, it had, significance for people living there going back to the Iron Age. And these aren't ruins. These are places that people have lived in continuously and are still living in and going about their day-to-day lives. And this is where I'm getting subjective. The strange thing was that it started to really, it made me angry in a way, because of the US attempt to destroy this civilization, this society, this culture, and also because this was also robbed. People were robbed of their culture when European settlers first arrived on this continent, North America. That continuity was disrupted by imperialism, and it was only the resistance of indigenous people here that prevented the destruction of their culture. But because if we don't have an intuitive daily sense of the thousands and thousands of years of human civilization that came before us when we walk down the street in the US, that's because of imperialism that available to us otherwise. So that was one thing that being in Syria, I wasn't able to get out of my mind when I came back.
Gosh, aside from the rampant destruction that you all have mentioned, I'm really glad that you were able to speak to the history of Syria and the places there that have been. These are some of the oldest living, breathing places on Earth, and it's incredible that they're, the US was supporting and assisting people who are actively destroying them. I mean, these are not just treasures for Syria, these are treasures for the entire human race. I mean, this is, these are historical treasures that are actively being destroyed by groups supported by the United States. And it's a shame. And I'm so happy to hear that you were able to go and visit them, and that despite US attempts to sort of destroy these important locations, that they remain, much like the Syrian people. Would anybody else like to talk about locations or places that sort of stood out to you, just like the one place?
Yeah, I'm gonna not follow instructions and just say two. So one was in Umayyad Square. I have no idea was, at the very least, like 100,000 people, in that one place, and, millions more throughout Damascus were celebrating. And it was just solving to be among those people, walking through the crowd, hearing people singing all these songs, doing all these chants. That was just amazing. And, actually getting to speak to those people, because, we had a translator, just like hearing their different stories and their backgrounds. So there was one guy from Kuwait. There was, you know, there were some kids. There were some, people who were older, people with all these different professions, and they were all united in, this anti-imperialist stance in support of, their own government, their own self-determination. And the second, I'm going to have to go with Ted and say Malula. That was also just moving the scale of the history of, the fact that people have been there for tens of thousands of years. And, just walking through it, like there's a kind of like serenity to some of these places that, I don't think I've ever seen anywhere else. And one thing that really struck me about the some of the churches that we visited in Maruda, we visited some of like the oldest churches in the world that have been around for nearly 2,000 years. And there were a lot of Muslims visiting those churches. There were Muslims who were having their names written down in this prayer book, a Christian prayer book, where I spoke with someone from Damascus, and our translator, and she told us that Muslims, Jews, atheists, Christians all go to this one place to get these nuns to pray for their families. And that just kind of, it so completely destroys this Western myth of the Middle East that these people are all just fighting, and it's always like of Islam and of Arabs in particular, that they're always just fighting and they can never get along with anybody else. But Syria, without U.S. intervention, without colonialism, without colonial control, is a melting pot of all these different ethnicities and all these different religions, and they respect each other and they can coexist because they have that level of dignity and of respect for one another's religions.
I think for me, the really impactful thing I'll remember would just be seeing Syrians vote. Especially we went to a voting location in Douma, which is a suburb of Damascus that was held by the armed groups for I think 5 or 6 years, maybe more. And people there actually couldn't vote during the last election 7 years ago. And, you know, we saw hundreds and hundreds of people coming to vote, and they were really excited about it. There was sort of a little rally happening outside the voting booth. And it was so almost the polar opposite of how it's portrayed in the media here. Douma in particular has been getting attention because President Assad and his wife actually went and voted there on the election day, not when we were there, but in that morning. And the media is saying things like, "Oh, this was a hotbed of rebel support, and this was like a big screw you to those people from the president, and nobody there was actually going to vote." But like I said, we saw the opposite. We saw hundreds of people, and to be sure, it was clearly a more conservative area, just based on how people dressed. But hundreds of people, and they kept coming. You know, we stuck around for a while, and we watched people vote and put their ballots in the box and everything. And then when we finally packed up and left, you know, there were just more and more people coming. They even had to open up some different. They set up a kind of an impromptu separate second place for people to line up because there were so many people there. And you know, in general, people were much more excited about voting than they are in the United States. It was a moving thing to see.
Incredible. Thank you, Wyatt. Thanks, y'all. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and take this moment. We have a couple minutes. I don't want to take us too far into the night here, but there are a few questions are coming to us from YouTube and other places. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you, and folks can just chime in with an answer if you have one, or you can just say pass. We don't want to answer that. All right. So question number one, I think I have a feeling folks are going to want to answer all of these questions. What was your sense of the average Syrian citizen's opinion of the average US citizen? Because here we often have this idea of we know what's best for them. We're told they hate us for our freedoms. What are their actual opinions of the US government or citizens or both? This is a great question.
Yeah, I can take a crack at it. So, you know, there's this kind of anti-imperialist leftist line that, you know, they'll use on for places like Syria. They'll say, you know, hate the government, love the people. You know, but of course not understanding that the people chose the government. But you know, Syrians actually lived that life. You know, they were so welcoming of us. You know, this group of mostly Americans. There was one woman in Yarmouk. I asked her, you know, what is your message to America? And she said, the first thing she said was, leave us alone. You know, and she said, you know, there's no such thing as Israel. Palestine is Palestine, and that is our land, and we have the right to go back. And a few minutes later, she was like, I want to come inside my house for coffee. You know, do you want to come into, it was the day after the elections. And she was like, you know, do you want to stay over for dinner, celebrate the election results? And, you know, this is someone who has been displaced by, you know, her family has been displaced by an American supported settler colonial state. And then she was further displaced by jihadists, you know, with American backing. And she knows this, you know, she very well understands what American imperialism has done to her life, you know, how it's displaced her and destroyed her home. and she's inviting these Americans into her home to celebrate with her and to eat with her. And a lot of Syrians were like that. The most the closest thing to hostility that I got as an American is when I was walking around in Wyatt Square on the night of the election results being announced. And there was one guy who didn't want to speak to me at first because he was like, "No, you're an American. You're gonna go back to America and you're gonna lie about us." And this is, based on all these reporters from all these mainstream media networks, going to Syria and then coming back complete misrepresentations. So, and this guy and his group of friends, like, they still like spoke to me. They still like they could have jumped me in that crowd, because it was like hundreds of thousands of people. It was at least 5 of them and one of me, so they could have easily beat me up if they wanted to. But instead, they spoke with me. They were just saying, just go tell the truth about what you saw here, and they were telling me about how we need to fight against the sanctions as Americans. So all of these things, they're having very, after all of what the U.S. and its partners have put Syrians through, they still don't have any animosity towards American individuals.
Well, Kobi, I'm very glad. I think we're all very glad that they did not jump you. We're happy to help you back in doing this report. Okay, so thank you, Kobi. That is really important for folks in the United States to hear, for folks in the movement to hear, the reaction of people in Syria to the people of the United States, and how that differs from their reaction to our reactionary government. Okay, next question. I'm going to just ask 2 more, and I'll try as quickly as I can. How can we better combat the Western chauvinism or white saviorism of the, quote, progressive left, which legitimizes operations? Anybody like to take a stab at that one?
I would. And we touched on it earlier, and I think you said it actually, Cassia, that great deal of ordinary working class Americans don't support the wars just broadly. And we see some people on the left who are trying to drive a wedge over Syria, or, spreading the same State Department lies and calling it progressive. Remember, those people are not, there might be activists in a sense, but generally they're journalists and they're academics, and they have a very kind of detached, abstract sense of these conflicts, and they see it as an opportunity to weigh in with their individual genius. But what I would say to do is go have a protest. Go, even if it's just holding a banner or some signs along the street. You go hold up signs that say, "Stop the wars, end U.S. imperialism, hands off Syria," on any major street in a U.S. city. You're going to see hundreds of people driving by, honking their horns, giving you the peace sign in support. And those are the people who we need to organize. And it's the masses, I guess. Freedom Road obviously emphasizes the mass line as a strategy, and I think that actually can work with the anti-war movement as well, because, like I say, you hold these actions, you see the people, you see the masses, they don't support these wars, even if some talking heads on TV or in some cool magazine support them.
Yeah, that's been my experience, Wyatt, for sure, in the anti-war movement. Whenever we have a banner, that says, U.S. out of the Middle East, or hands off Syria, or no war in the Middle East, the amount of support you'll get from people, despite whatever weird bumper stickers they have on their car, whatever political candidate they're supporting, you'll get their support. It's a common belief, within the United States that the US shouldn't be waging war against the people of the world. So, okay. Last question from our various chats, and then I'll just ask you guys to do a quick sum up. Question is, what can trade unionists do to bring an anti-imperialist perspective to rank and file workers? So again, what can trade unionists do to bring an anti-imperialist perspective to rank and file?
You can take a crack at that one. One thing that is abundantly clear in Syria is that Syrians know who their enemy is. Their enemy is the most dire enemy that they face and have faced for the last 10 years is U.S. imperialism, the Zionist occupation. I think workers in the United States can benefit from being clearer on who our enemy is, and we'll find that we share a common enemy with the Syrian people. It's our own government. That the same state that kills people in the streets of Chicago, Minneapolis, and Philadelphia is killing people in the streets of Damascus and Aleppo. And I think that we've seen certainly a leap forward in progressive working class consciousness in the U.S., led as always by Black workers in the Black liberation struggle. And there are certain trade unions that are very political. The ILWU, the Longshore Workers Union, will shut down a port if they can organize their rank and file. And I think that it would be great to see more political strike actions and workplace actions taking place. There is one form or another, every congressional district in this country has some military industrial complex profit-seeking endeavor everywhere. It is the fabric of the U.S. economy, which is, that is the nature of empire, but it does give us a lot of opportunities for workplace actions that could disrupt war.
Thanks, Ted. That's absolutely correct. And we have seen, whether for Palestine or for Syria, for other, international causes, we have seen the longshoremen and other rank and file union members sort of take the lead in resisting U.S. wars. Even during the Iraq War, that was a major thing. So, all right, folks. So aside from we have some shout outs in the chat, people coming all the way from Ontario to shout us out from the Syria Solidarity Movement. We got some chants in the chat, US out of Syria, US out of the Middle East, hell yeah. Thank you all for watching and supporting and engaging with us. Before I let these folks go, I'm like running out of sunlight over here. Before I let folks go, I wanted to ask you, one final message. What would your message be? Ted, Wyatt, Kobi, what would your message be? Firkins, what message do you think is most important for people listening to this, who will listen to this later on, to understand about the situation in Syria right now?
I can go first. So the main thing I think is that your enemy, just like Ted said earlier, your enemy is US imperialism. You're not alive to figure out how every single country in the world is doing, right? You're being exploited by the same imperialists who are trying to exploit people in Syria, and who are trying to destroy every sovereign country in the world so that they can, have their empire, and, have this like uninterrupted ability to just steal all the resources from everywhere. And, it's our responsibility in the US to oppose that, because by opposing that, we're fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for working and oppressed people all over the world, oppose US imperialism. And it matters, every every front of struggle against imperialism matters. So, people will say, well, why do you care what's going on in Syria? Because it is important. It is important what the U.S. is trying to. It is important that we oppose what the U.S. is trying to do in every country. So yeah, that's my message to people in the.
I'll say that if there's one message, it's, we understand that the working class is what creates history. History is created by the working class, and that the oppression of our people on the basis of national oppression and race, gender oppression, ability, all of these structures to keep the working class subjugated exists to slow down history, to keep the current ruling class, the capitalist class, in charge. And when it's hard to go around the places in Syria that we mentioned that have been destroyed without thinking of how many years have been lost and how long it's going, not just the years of fighting, but how many years it's now going to take to rebuild. There can't be progress in history made when there is an entity like the US empire going around wreaking havoc and sowing chaos like this. And I think because we are the working class at the heart of that empire, we have a big responsibility to do something about that.
I would just say Syrians are ready for this terrible, terrible war to be over. And in many ways, it is coming to an end. And the government controls most of the country again. And people are trying to move back to their homes and rebuild their lives. And the biggest obstacle to that right now is the United States, with occupation in eastern Syria, with the sanctions, and showing signs of maybe even trying to support some armed groups to overthrow the government again. And and frankly, I think that's a message for people, regardless what you think of the Syrian government. 10 years of war is enough. Many of the if there were moderate rebels that we talked about, many of them have already even accepted amnesty offers and reconciled with the government. Like, it just is so strange to me that the Biden administration wants us to say no, another 10 years or something. I just think we need to say no more. It's over. Let's let people get back to their life.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear. Thank you all so much. I am very honored to have been able to moderate this discussion. You all had so much knowledge and experience to share with me and everybody who tuned in. As a Syrian American myself, I am grateful for you all for going and for spreading this incredibly crucial information to the people of the United States, so that we can continue to resist US imperialism throughout the world, throughout the Arab world, and throughout Syria in particular. May Syria continue to prosper and throw off the chains of US imperialism. And with that, I bid everybody a very good night. Long live Syria and US imperialism. And I'll see you all another time. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.